December 24th, 1944, northeastern France. The wind moved across the frozen ground in slow, steady breaths. Snow pressed softly against the wire fencing of a temporary Allied holding camp carved into the edge of a shattered French town. Beyond the perimeter, church towers stood scarred by artillery. Windows were dark. The war had not paused for winter. Inside the enclosure, a small group of German women sat on wooden benches beneath canvas roofing. Most were communications auxiliaries and clerical staff captured during the Allied advance after the breakout from Normandy. They wore field gray coats over civilian dresses, boots still caked with mud from retreat. Weeks earlier, they had fled westward under collapsing German command structures. Now they waited under American guard. They expected silence. They expected orders barked in English. They expected the cold. Instead, as dusk deepened into blue twilight, a sound carried through the brittle air, distant, measured, unmistakable. Church bells. A few minutes later, American voices followed. Not shouted commands, not drills, carols. The melody drifted over the wire and into the enclosure, slow and deliberate. Silent Night, a hymn written in German more than a century earlier. Some of the women looked toward the guard tower. The floodlight hummed. No one spoke. For the first time since their capture, the war felt momentarily uncertain. Not because of gunfire, but because of something familiar. And that moment belonged to a much larger story already unfolding across a collapsing continent. By December 1944, the war in Western Europe had entered its final and most decisive phase. 6 months earlier, on June 6, 1944, Allied forces had landed along the beaches of Normandy. Operation Overlord shattered the Atlantic Wall and forced Germany into a fighting retreat across France. By late August, Paris was liberated. By autumn, Allied armies stood along Germany's western frontier. The Wehrmacht was stretched thin, its divisions depleted, its logistics strained, and its air superiority broken by relentless American and British bombing campaigns. The collapse was not limited to frontline combat units. Behind every German field army stood an extensive network of support personnel: clerks, radio operators, meteorological assistants, signal specialists, and medical staff. Many of these roles were filled by women under the designation Wehrmachthelferinnen, female auxiliaries attached to the German armed forces. Though not combat soldiers, they wore uniforms, took oaths, and were integrated into military infrastructure. By 1944, tens of thousands of German women serve in communications, air defense coordination, transport administration, and nursing roles. As Allied forces advanced through France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, these support networks collapsed along with the divisions they sustained. Headquarters were overrun, signal posts abandoned, field hospitals evacuated in haste. In the confusion of retreat, many auxiliaries were captured, not on battlefields, but on roads clogged with vehicles in rail depots or within administrative compounds left exposed by the speed of Allied maneuver warfare. For many German women serving in these capacities, capture was sudden. Propaganda from Berlin had long depicted American forces as undisciplined and vengeful. Nazi broadcasts warned of brutality at the hands of enemy troops. Such messaging intensified after the Allied strategic bombing of German cities. Women in uniform, especially those who had served close to frontline operations, were instructed to fear mistreatment if captured. But by late 1944, the reality facing the Third Reich was far more urgent than propaganda could conceal. German command cohesion was deteriorating. Fuel shortages crippled mechanized movement. Luftwaffe presence in the West had dwindled to sporadic sorties. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's final major offensive in the West, began on December 16, 1944, only days before the Christmas described in the opening scene. Even as that counteroffensive briefly surprised Allied lines in the Ardennes, the overall strategic picture remained clear. Germany lacked the reserves to reverse the war's trajectory. In this environment, prisoners accumulated rapidly. The United States, as the principal custodian of captured German personnel in the Western Theater, processed hundreds of thousands of POWs during 1944 and 1945. These prisoners included regular Wehrmacht soldiers, Luftwaffe ground crews, naval personnel, Volksgrenadiers, and, though smaller in number, female auxiliaries attached to military units. Under international law, specifically the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, captured personnel were entitled to certain protections: adequate shelter, food, medical care, and the right to practice religion. The United States had ratified these conventions and, broadly speaking, adhered to them throughout the conflict. Compliance was not merely moral, it was strategic. Humane treatment reinforced American claims of fighting a lawful war and encouraged reciprocal treatment of Allied POWs held by Germany. Thus, when German women auxiliaries were captured in late 1944, they entered a system already established to process large volumes of prisoners. Initial holding camps in France served as temporary enclosures, barbed wire perimeters, canvas tents, floodlights powered by portable generators. Prisoners were searched, documented, and segregated by rank and category. Women were separated from male POW populations when numbers allowed, housed under guarded supervision but within the same regulatory framework. The shock was not immediate comfort. It was order. Rations were distributed according to standard POW guidelines. Red Cross parcels supplemented camp provisions. Medical examinations were conducted. Chaplains moved through Allied units, often organizing services for American troops, services that, by law, prisoners were permitted to attend under supervision if facilities allowed. 4 German women raised under a regime that framed the war in existential, racial terms. The experience of structured captivity within a regulated system presented a contradiction. The enemy was not faceless chaos. It was organized, procedural, and bound by international agreements Germany itself had signed. Yet the war had not ended. The Ardennes offensive raged, snow-covered trenches and forests alike. Casualties mounted on both sides. American soldiers who sang carols in December 1944 would return to frozen foxholes by morning. And as these prisoners settled into the routines of confinement, the broader machinery of American POW policy extended far beyond the temporary enclosures of France, reaching across the Atlantic to camps inside the United States itself. By the end of 1944, the United States was holding German prisoners not only in Europe, but across the Atlantic. The decision to transfer large numbers of POWs to North America had begun earlier in the war. Britain, strained by bombing and overcrowded facilities, requested assistance. Beginning in 1943, German prisoners captured in North Africa and later in Europe were shipped to camps across the United States. By the war's end in 1945, approximately 370,000 German POWs would be held on American soil, distributed among more than 500 base camps and branch facilities in states such as Texas, Arizona, Oklahoma, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Wisconsin. These camps were not hidden. Many were constructed near agricultural regions where prisoner labor could supplement wartime labor shortages. American farmers, facing the absence of enlisted workers, relied on POW work details for harvesting crops and maintaining infrastructure. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be required to perform non-combat labor, provided it was not dangerous or directly connected to the war effort. The environment inside these camps surprised many captives. Barracks were typically wooden structures with bunks, heating stoves, and sanitation facilities. Meals were regulated and, by 1944 standards, adequate. In some cases, German POWs received rations comparable in caloric value to American soldiers stationed stateside. The War Department understood the diplomatic implications. Treatment of German prisoners would influence how American POWs were treated in Europe. 4 German women captured in Western Europe during 1944 and 1945. Most were initially held in temporary camps near the front. A smaller number were later transferred to longer-term facilities, either in liberated territories or, in rare cases, to designated compounds in the United States. Their numbers were never large compared to male POW populations, but their presence required administrative adjustments, separate quarters, female medical oversight when available, and careful adherence to convention guidelines regarding privacy and supervision. Yet, beyond regulations and infrastructure, there was a cultural dimension that neither side fully anticipated. Many German auxiliaries had grown up in a state where the regime tightly controlled media, education, and religious institutions. The Nazi government promoted a version of Christianity aligned with its ideology, while suppressing dissenting clergy. Christmas itself remained a public holiday in Germany during the war, but it was increasingly reframed through nationalist symbolism, blending traditional Christian observance with state messaging. In American camps, Christmas retained a different tone. For U.S. soldiers, December 25th was not merely a religious observance, but a reminder of home. Chaplains organized services in makeshift chapels or open fields. Hymns were sung in English. Letters were read aloud. In larger stateside POW camps, Christmas often included modest decorations. Evergreen branches, simple trees erected in recreation halls, and occasional musical performances by American military bands. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners retained the right to religious practice. In many camps, German prisoners were permitted to organize their own services, sometimes led by clergy captured among them. In other instances, American chaplains facilitated access to worship spaces under supervision. Christmas 1944 and 1945 would see documented cases of additional rations, small allowances of sweets, improved bread, or coffee, distributed in recognition of the holiday. The policy was not sentimental. It was deliberate. The U.S. War Department understood that humane treatment carried strategic weight. Intelligence officers noted that well-treated prisoners were more cooperative during interrogation. Propaganda units documented camp conditions to counter German claims of mistreatment. Newspapers occasionally published photographs of orderly compounds and recreational activities. The message was clear: America adhered to international law. For German women who had been instructed to expect humiliation or violence, the contrast could be unsettling. The enemy spoke firmly, but did not strike. Guards enforced regulations, but also attended church services. American soldiers who had fought through Normandy and the Hurtgen Forest now stood watch beneath strings of electric lights during a winter holiday. The contradiction deepened during moments of shared tradition. Silent Night, composed in Austria in 1818, was known across Germany. It had been sung in trenches during the First World War. It belonged to both nations' cultural heritage. When American units sang it in English, or occasionally in German, the melody carried across camp boundaries without translation. Within this environment, Christmas did not erase captivity. Barbed wire remained. Guards remained armed. The war remained violent beyond the perimeter. But for a brief interval, the rigid lines drawn by ideology softened in the presence of ritual. And it was within that space, between regulation and humanity, between enemy and shared tradition, that deeper dimensions of the story begin to emerge. We now turn to those dimensions from multiple angles. For the German women held in Allied custody in late 1944 and early 1945, the most powerful shock was not physical hardship. It was psychological dissonance. Many had grown up inside a closed information system. From childhood, they had been taught that Germany was encircled by hostile powers. By 1943 and 1944, Allied bombing raids reinforced the message of total war. American aircraft had reduced entire districts of Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden to rubble. Civilian casualties were real. Fear was real. Loss was real. The enemy, therefore, was imagined as relentless. Capture brought confrontation with a different reality. American processing procedures were methodical. Prisoners were cataloged, issued identification numbers, and assigned quarters. Guards enforced discipline but did not permit vigilante violence. Food arrived at predictable hours. Medical personnel treated illness regardless of nationality. For women who had expected vengeance, this order created uncertainty. It did not immediately inspire trust. Suspicion lingered. Some feared that humane behavior masked future punishment. Others remained silent, cautious, withdrawn. Then came small details. American soldiers sharing cigarettes. A medic explaining treatment in slow, careful phrases. A chaplain speaking about Christmas without reference to politics or race. These were not dramatic gestures. They were routine acts within a regulated system. Yet for prisoners shaped by years of ideological framing, they carried weight. Christmas intensified that contrast. German tradition held Christmas Eve, Heiligabend, as the emotional center of the holiday. Families gathered. Candles were lit. Hymns were sung quietly. Even during wartime blackouts, households tried to preserve ritual. Inside Allied camps, German women faced their first Christmas away from home, uncertain whether their families were safe. Letters moved slowly across wartime channels. News from Germany was fragmented. The front lines were fluid. When American guards sang carols audible beyond the wire, the sound did not erase captivity. It introduced familiarity into an unfamiliar space. The melody of Still Nacht, Silent Night, did not belong exclusively to one side. Its origin in the German-speaking world meant it carried shared cultural memory. Hearing it sung by American voices complicated the narrative of absolute difference. The human dimension lay not in sentiment, but in recognition. Recognition that the men in uniform beyond the fence also missed home. Recognition that Christmas, stripped of propaganda, retained older roots. Recognition that the war's ideological divide did not entirely extinguish common tradition. That recognition did not end loyalty to Germany. It did not dismantle years of belief overnight, but it introduced doubt into the certainty of enmity. And doubt, in wartime, is a powerful force. The observance of Christmas inside American-controlled camps was not improvised. The United States military maintained an organized chaplain corps representing Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish clergy. Throughout the war, chaplains accompanied units across Europe and within stateside installations. Their duties included conducting worship services, counseling soldiers, and ensuring religious rights were upheld, including those of prisoners. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs were entitled to practice their religion. In camps holding German prisoners, this often meant permitting Catholic and Protestant services conducted either by captured clergy or facilitated by American chaplains. Records from stateside camps indicate that Christmas services were routinely organized for German POWs, sometimes in separate facilities, sometimes in shared chapels under guard supervision. The moral logic was layered. For American leadership, observance of religious freedom reinforced the narrative of lawful conduct. It demonstrated contrast with the totalitarian system the Allies were fighting. It reassured American troops that their nation remained committed to constitutional principles even in war. For chaplains on the ground, the duty was pastoral rather than political. Christmas sermons focused on themes of peace, endurance, and hope, messages relevant to soldiers and prisoners alike. When German women heard carols or saw modest decorations within American camps, they witnessed an expression of faith not tightly bound to state ideology. There were no political banners in chapel spaces, no portraits of leaders, no speeches invoking racial destiny. The holiday centered on scripture and song. This distinction mattered. In Germany, by 1944, Christmas celebrations coexisted uneasily with total war mobilization. Allied bombing had disrupted cities. Air raid sirens punctuated December nights. Resources were scarce. Families lit candles carefully amid blackout regulations. In contrast, American camps, though far from luxurious, possessed stability. Electricity functioned. Food shipments arrived. Chaplains moved freely within policy constraints. The moral framework extended beyond worship. In several documented camps, small improvements in rations were authorized for Christmas. Extra bread, occasional sweets, coffee. These gestures complied with regulation, but also acknowledged shared cultural significance. For German prisoners, including women auxiliaries, this combination of structure and recognition challenged expectations shaped by propaganda. The war remained violent beyond the perimeter. In the Ardennes, American and German forces fought in snow-covered forests at the same moment carols were sung in rear areas. Casualty lists lengthened daily. Yet within the camp, the moral code held. It was not an act of mercy detached from strategy. It was policy executed consistently, and that consistency became part of the psychological landscape prisoners carried with them into the final months of the war. And beyond the human and moral dimensions, there were deeper strategic calculations shaping this approach. American policy toward German prisoners in 1944 was not shaped by sentiment. It was shaped by calculation. The United States had ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention. Germany had as well. Compliance carried practical benefits. Intelligence officers understood that prisoners treated according to regulation were more cooperative during questioning. Reports from the European theater noted that German POWs often provided reliable tactical information when they believed they would not be abused. Humane treatment also served diplomatic leverage. The War Department monitored the condition of American POWs held in Germany through Red Cross channels. Any deviation from Geneva's standards risked reciprocal retaliation. Maintaining documented compliance strengthened American protest when violations occurred. There was another layer. The Allied war effort increasingly framed itself as a moral struggle against totalitarianism. Newsreels shown in American theaters depicted orderly POW compounds and work details harvesting crops under guard, but without chains. Photographs circulated of German prisoners playing soccer inside fenced enclosures in Texas or Arizona. These images were not accidental. They reinforced a message. The United States fought the German regime, not the German people. 4 German women auxiliaries captured during the collapse of the Western Front. This distinction was subtle but significant. They were not interrogated as ideological symbols. They were processed as military personnel. Their status under the convention was administrative. Even the decision to permit Christmas observance aligned with strategic discipline. Suppressing religious practice would have gained little and undermined American credibility. Allowing it cost almost nothing and reinforced lawful authority. Yet discipline required balance. Camp commanders were responsible for preventing Nazi hardliners from organizing resistance within compounds. In some male POW camps, committed National Socialists attempted to intimidate fellow prisoners deemed disloyal. American authorities separated agitators when necessary. Order was preserved through structure, not indulgence. Thus, Christmas in an American POW facility did not represent softness. It represented confidence. Confidence that adherence to law did not weaken control. Confidence that restraint demonstrated strength. And that confidence contrasted sharply with the increasingly desperate posture of the Third Reich in late 1944. For prisoners, especially those indoctrinated from adolescence, experience could erode certainty. German women serving as auxiliaries had often been members of Nazi youth organizations. Education emphasized loyalty and sacrifice. American forces were depicted as culturally inferior or morally corrupt. Capture disrupted that narrative, but Christmas sharpened the disruption. Hearing American soldiers sing hymns rooted in European tradition complicated the image of a godless enemy. Seeing guards exchange modest gifts or decorate a mess hall with evergreen branches introduced familiarity into captivity. Observing chaplains speak openly about faith without invoking political slogans suggested a separation between religion and state authority unfamiliar in wartime Germany. Psychological transformation did not occur overnight. Many prisoners remained loyal to the regime through 1945. Some dismissed American observances as propaganda. Others retreated inward, uncertain what to believe. But for some, the contrast lingered. Post-war testimonies from German POWs held in the United States often describe surprise at material conditions and religious freedom inside camps. Though most accounts involve male prisoners due to their greater numbers, the broader framework applied equally to women held under similar regulations. The shock was cumulative rather than dramatic. Predictable meals, respectful address, access to worship, the absence of arbitrary violence. In a regime built on ideological absolutism, such steadiness introduced doubt. And doubt would matter when the war ended. Policies are written in offices. Their meaning is determined in execution. American camp commanders were career officers tasked with balancing security and regulation. They answered to the provost marshal general's office and adhered to detailed directives regarding prisoner treatment. Christmas observances required coordination. Chaplains organized services. Supply officers approved modest ration adjustments. Guards maintained perimeter security while allowing controlled assembly inside compounds. Reports from stateside camps indicate that some commanders encouraged structured holiday activities precisely to maintain morale and discipline, both for prisoners and for American personnel assigned to guard duty far from home. In European holding facilities closer to active fronts, observances were simpler. A brief service, a few hymns, perhaps a chaplain moving between enclosures. The structure held because leadership insisted upon it. And within that structure, something subtle occurred. Not a truce, not reconciliation, but a pause in hostility defined by ritual rather than gunfire. The stage was set for a moment when policy, culture, and circumstance converged in a single winter night. We now approach that turning point. December 24th, 1944. The Ardennes forest burned in the distance. 8 days earlier, German forces had launched a surprise counteroffensive through Belgium and Luxembourg. The Battle of the Bulge was underway. Snow fell heavily across the region. American divisions were under immense pressure. Roads were clogged with armor, ambulances, and supply trucks struggling through ice. And yet, behind the shifting front lines, the machinery of custody continued. In a temporary Allied holding camp in northeastern France, German prisoners, among them female communications auxiliaries captured during the Allied advance, remained under guard. The sounds of distant artillery could sometimes be heard like muted thunder rolling across the horizon. The war had not paused for Christmas, but the calendar had turned. By late afternoon, temperatures dropped sharply. The sky dimmed into a metallic gray. American guards rotated shifts, stamping their boots against the cold. Some had arrived in France only months earlier, following the landings in Normandy. Others had endured the Hürtgen forest and were now reassigned to rear area duties after wounds or exhaustion. Inside the enclosure, the prisoners followed routine. Rations had been distributed earlier in the day. A chaplain had visited in the morning, accompanied by a translator. Under supervision, he announced that a brief Christmas service would be permitted at dusk. Attendance was voluntary. Guards would remain posted. There was no decoration beyond what could be improvised. A small evergreen branch placed near a crate that served as a table. No candles were allowed inside the canvas structure due to fire risk. Light came from a single electric bulb strung from a generator line. When evening fell, the women gathered. Some stood rigidly. Others clasped gloved hands. A few stared downward, lost in private thought. Home felt impossibly distant. Letters sent weeks earlier had not yet been answered. News from Germany was scarce and often contradictory. Outside the enclosure, American soldiers assembled separately for their own service near a field kitchen tent. The chaplain moved between groups, his breath visible in the cold air. He began with scripture, passages common to Protestant and Catholic liturgy alike. The words were spoken in English first, then summarized in German by the interpreter. No reference was made to politics. No mention of victory or defeat. Only the nativity narrative. Then came the hymns. Silent Night. The melody carried easily across the frozen ground. It did not require translation. Some of the German prisoners lifted their heads when they heard it sung in English. The cadence differed slightly, but the structure was the same. The tune had crossed oceans long before the war began. It belonged to shared European heritage. A second verse followed. This time the chaplain invited those inside the enclosure to sing in their own language. Guard rifles remained slung. Floodlights remained active. The perimeter did not disappear. But for several minutes, voices overlapped across a line of barbed wire. The scene was not dramatic in scale. There were no grand gestures, no symbolic lowering of arms. The war still raged less than 50 miles away. Casualty reports from the Ardennes would reach headquarters before morning. Yet within that fence perimeter, something shifted. German women who had expected harshness encountered formality and restraint. American soldiers who had fought through months of brutal combat stood quietly while prisoners sang in their own tongue. The turning point was not a military breakthrough. It was recognition. Recognition that the enemy across the wire celebrated the same holiday. Recognition that beneath uniform and ideology lay shared cultural inheritance older than the regimes now at war. The service ended without applause. Prisoners returned to their quarters. Guards resumed patrol. Snow continued to fall. But the sound of that hymn lingered, carried in memory long after the night had passed. And as the war entered its final winter, the implications of that moment would extend beyond the fence and into the final collapse of the Third Reich. Christmas night did not end the Battle of the Bulge. On December 25, 1944, American forces at Bastogne remained encircled. Supply shortages intensified. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Artillery exchanges continued without pause. Casualties mounted on both sides. The war's violence pressed forward, indifferent to liturgical calendars. But within prisoner compounds scattered across France, Belgium, and across the Atlantic in the United States, the memory of Christmas Eve lingered. 4 German women auxiliaries held in temporary camps in Europe. The experience of regulated worship under American supervision introduced a contradiction difficult to dismiss. They had expected humiliation. Instead, they encountered procedure. They had expected suppression. Instead, they were permitted to sing. The distinction was not sentimental. It was structural. American compliance with the Geneva Convention was visible in daily routine. Predictable rations, medical attention, written documentation, authorized correspondence through Red Cross channels. Christmas observance fit within that framework. It was not an exception carved from discipline. It was an expression of it. In several documented POW camps in the United States during December 1944 and 1945, German prisoners, overwhelmingly male due to the demographics of capture, were allowed to erect modest Christmas trees within recreation halls. Camp records describe small theatrical performances, choir rehearsals, and even handcrafted ornaments made from scrap materials. Extra food allocations were sometimes authorized within regulated limits. Chaplains conducted services in both English and German, where clergy were available. These practices were not improvised acts of charity. They were consistent with policy. 4 German women who had been raised in a system where loyalty to state and faith were increasingly intertwined with political ideology, the American separation of ritual from propaganda could be disorienting. In the camp service, there were no portraits of political leaders, no banners, no speeches invoking destiny, only scripture and song. The psychological effect unfolded. Gradually, some prisoners remained resolute in loyalty to the Reich even as its military position deteriorated. The Ardennes offensive failed by late January 1945. Allied forces resumed their advance toward the Rhine. Soviet armies pressed from the east. German cities endured intensified bombing. Reports filtered into camps that Cologne had fallen, that the Western Allies were approaching the Ruhr industrial region. Within weeks, the inevitability of defeat became undeniable. In that context, memories of regulated captivity gained new weight. Prisoners evaluated experience against expectation. They compared the warnings of propaganda with the conduct they had witnessed. Humane treatment did not erase the devastation of war. It did not absolve the Allied bombing campaign, but it complicated the narrative of absolute moral inversion presented by the regime. By early 1945, American authorities were already planning for post-war administration and re-education. In stateside camps, structured educational programs were introduced for German POWs. Lectures on democratic governance, exposure to uncensored newspapers, supervised discussions intended to counter National Socialist ideology. These programs expanded after Germany's surrender in May 1945. The groundwork for receptivity, however, had been laid earlier in routine interactions, and in moments like Christmas. For female auxiliaries, whose service roles often place them in communications or administrative positions rather than frontline combat, exposure to American systems of organization and religious practice may have been especially striking. They observed a military culture that combined discipline with legal constraint. They saw chaplains move openly between authority and pastoral care. They experienced custody without systemic degradation. The turning point, therefore, was not confined to a single evening hymn. It was the realization that the enemy operated under a framework different from what they had been taught. And when Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945, that realization shaped how many prisoners interpreted the collapse of the state they had served. The war's final months would bring repatriation, occupation, and reckoning, consequences extending far beyond the wire of a winter camp. We now move into the aftermath of that winter and the broader transformation that followed. Christmas night did not end the Battle of the Bulge. On December 25, 1944, American forces at Bastogne remained encircled. Supply shortages intensified. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Artillery exchanges continued without pause. Casualties mounted on both sides. The war's violence pressed forward, indifferent to liturgical calendars. But within prisoner compounds scattered across France, Belgium, and across the Atlantic in the United States, the memory of Christmas Eve lingered. 4 German women auxiliaries held in temporary camps in Europe. The experience of regulated worship under American supervision introduced a contradiction difficult to dismiss. They had expected humiliation. Instead, they encountered procedure. They had expected suppression. Instead, they were permitted to sing. The distinction was not sentimental. It was structural. American compliance with the Geneva Convention was visible in daily routine. Predictable rations, medical attention, written documentation, authorized correspondence through Red Cross channels. Christmas observance fit within that framework. It was not an exception carved from discipline. It was an expression of it. In several documented POW camps in the United States during December 1944 and 1945, German prisoners, overwhelmingly male due to the demographics of capture, were allowed to erect modest Christmas trees within recreation halls. Camp records describe small theatrical performances, choir rehearsals, and even handcrafted ornaments made from scrap materials. Extra food allocations were sometimes authorized within regulated limits. Chaplains conducted services in both English and German, where clergy were available. These practices were not improvised acts of charity. They were consistent with policy. 4 German women who had been raised in a system where loyalty to state and faith were increasingly intertwined with political ideology. The American separation of ritual from propaganda could be disorienting. In the camp service, there were no portraits of political leaders, no banners, no speeches invoking destiny, only scripture and song. The psychological effect unfolded gradually. Some prisoners remained resolute in loyalty to the Reich even as its military position deteriorated. The Ardennes offensive failed by late January 1945. Allied forces resumed their advance toward the Rhine. Soviet armies pressed from the east. German cities endured intensified bombing. Reports filtered into camps that Cologne had fallen, that the Western Allies were approaching the Ruhr industrial region. Within weeks, the inevitability of defeat became undeniable. In that context, memories of regulated captivity gained new weight. Prisoners evaluated experience against expectation. They compared the warnings of propaganda with the conduct they had witnessed. Humane treatment did not erase the devastation of war. It did not absolve the Allied bombing campaign, but it complicated the narrative of absolute moral inversion presented by the regime. By early 1945, American authorities were already planning for post-war administration and re-education. In stateside camps, structured educational programs were introduced for German POWs. Lectures on democratic governance, exposure to uncensored newspapers, supervised discussions intended to counter National Socialist ideology. These programs expanded after Germany's surrender in May 1945. The groundwork for receptivity, however, had been laid earlier in routine interactions and in moments like Christmas. For female auxiliaries, whose service roles often place them in communications or administrative positions rather than frontline combat, exposure to American systems of organization and religious practice may have been especially striking. They observed a military culture that combined discipline with legal constraint. They saw chaplains move openly between authority and pastoral care. They experienced custody without systemic degradation. The turning point, therefore, was not confined to a single evening hymn. It was the realization that the enemy operated under a framework different from what they had been taught. And when Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945, that realization shaped how many prisoners interpreted the collapse of the state they had served. The war's final months would bring repatriation, occupation, and reckoning, consequences extending far beyond the wire of a winter camp. We now move into the aftermath of that winter and the broader transformation that followed. By late 1945, most German prisoners held by the United States had begun returning home. Ports in New York, New Jersey, and Baltimore processed thousands of POWs by ship, while rail networks transported others across the continent. For female auxiliaries, the journey was often less publicized than that of male soldiers, yet it remained arduous. They returned to cities and towns devastated by air raids, to families displaced or deceased, and to a nation under Allied occupation. The legacy of their captivity was multifaceted. Historians note that experiences inside American camps shaped post-war perspectives on authority, law, and morality. Women who had witnessed strict adherence to Geneva Convention standards recognized a stark contrast with the totalitarian structure they had served. They observed that discipline could coexist with humane treatment, that enforcement of rules did not require cruelty, and that rituals like Christmas could persist even in the shadow of war. These realizations intersected with denazification efforts. The Allied authorities implemented programs to dismantle Nazi influence within the German population, emphasizing education, democratic participation, and exposure to alternative political and social systems. Prisoners who had experienced consistent, humane oversight often engaged more constructively with these programs, integrating lessons of lawful authority and civic responsibility. Cultural observations also left a lasting impression. Many German POWs, male and female, recalled the Christmas of 1944 or 1945 as a moment of humanization, a pause when enemies recognized shared traditions. Singing familiar hymns alongside American soldiers, observing organized yet non-political celebrations, and receiving small allowances of food or gifts challenged the rigid narratives imposed by the Nazi regime. These memories endured as poignant examples of wartime contrast, illustrating how humanity can persist even amidst conflict. Repatriation itself carried emotional weight. Some returned with relief, others with guilt or survivor's remorse. Letters from relatives provided updates, but often revealed loss and hardship. Returning to occupied Germany required psychological adjustment as much as physical relocation. The world they entered bore little resemblance to the one they had left. Occupation authorities, infrastructure destruction, and Allied control reshaped everyday life. Yet within these realities, the imprint of their POW experience remained. Structured routines, lawful treatment, and moments of unexpected compassion demonstrated that the conduct of war could vary significantly depending on leadership and policy. For the women who had heard carols echo across barbed wire, the memory persisted not as a sentimental anecdote, but as a tangible example of order, restraint, and cultural continuity amidst chaos. As historians later noted, these experiences contributed to broader narratives of reconciliation and post-war reconstruction. They shaped the perception of America in the eyes of returning POWs, influencing attitudes during the rebuilding of Germany and the eventual integration of former soldiers and auxiliaries into a society recovering from totalitarian collapse. And with the war formally ended, the lessons of that December night, of humanity observed even across lines of conflict, set the stage for reflection that would resonate far beyond any single prisoner camp. The Christmas of 1944, experienced by German women prisoners in American custody, stands as a quiet paradox of World War II. Amid the chaos of collapsing fronts, artillery barges, and widespread human suffering, a simple act, singing a shared hymn, observing ritual under guard, exchanging small tokens of recognition, revealed the persistence of humanity within war's machinery. For prisoners raised under strict ideology, the juxtaposition was striking. They had been taught to expect brutality, to fear the enemy, to believe that captivity meant degradation. Instead, they found structure, order, and even acknowledgement of common cultural traditions. The experience did not erase the violence of the world beyond the fence, nor did it absolve the immense destruction inflicted by the war. Yet it challenged assumptions, reshaped perceptions, and planted seeds of reflection that would influence post-war attitudes and behaviors. The significance of this moment extends beyond the personal. It illustrates a principle that warfare, even in its darkest periods, is bounded by policy, law, and deliberate leadership. The U.S. adherence to the Geneva Convention, the organized observance of religious holidays, and the careful maintenance of order within camps demonstrated that discipline could coexist with compassion. Moments such as the Christmas carols in 1944 created psychological impact far exceeding their scale, shaping how prisoners perceived authority, justice, and moral responsibility. Ultimately, the story of German women POWs and an American Christmas is more than a wartime anecdote. It is a testament to the enduring capacity for empathy, the subtle power of ritual, and the way human connection can persist even across lines drawn by ideology and conflict. In remembering these moments, we are reminded that history is defined not only by battles and strategy, but by the choices individuals make within the structures of war, choices that can illuminate shared humanity, even in the shadow of global conflict.